to stay together, or?
Well, I think we can stay together with 8.
Okay, we'll stay together then for the whole time. So we're going to have a couple of questions that kind of specifically address what Lisa has to say to us. And then some of the other questions we'll conclude with. We'll kind of bring in everything that we might have heard. Okay, so Rick, as usual, is going to give us a little intro to our theologian here. And is she a theologian? Not exactly.
I'm not certain that she would call herself a theologian. Lisa Sharon Harper, at the time that this interview was made, was on the staff of Sojourners magazine as their director of mobilizing. Meanwhile, since then, she has earned an MA at Columbia in the field of human rights. And she has founded an organization called Freedom Road, which has a website, freedomroad.us, which teaches clergy and other community leaders how to organize people of faith in the effort for a just world. That is their mission statement. And some of the areas that they take on are of obvious relevance to the systemic matters that we've been discussing these past couple of months now. They include tax reform, immigration reform, healthcare reform, poverty, racial justice, and civic engagement in general. What they do in their spare time, I don't know. But this is Lisa Sharon Harper.
Okay.
The role of the church is to be a witness of the presence of the kingdom of God. Because here's the thing, Jesus entered in Luke. Jesus said, the kingdom is here. This is not...
Oh, I'm sorry.
I mean, yes, there's a not yet aspect to it, but Jesus himself said, the kingdom of God is near, at hand. You can touch it. In other words, it's him. He's the king. If he's here, the king is here, the kingdom is here. Now, what does that mean? And I think that that's where we go back and we understand that what it means to exercise dominion in a godly way is to exercise it in a way that fans the flame of the image of God in all, that affirms the capacity and the call of all humanity to exercise dominion. And so it means setting the oppressed free. And so it means, and that just means, it means on every level. It means those who are oppressed within themselves, oppressed by shame, those who are oppressed within their families, oppressed by relationships within their siblings, or oppressed by domestic violence, or oppressed within cities, within nations and governance, by race, by gender discrimination, oppressed between nations. That's the good news, is that Jesus came to free those who have been oppressed by domination, by the lie that only some were created in God's image. Only some were created with the full call and the capacity to exercise dominion. Jesus comes directly against that. He says, no, that Samaritan woman, she was created to exercise dominion. She was created in the full image of God. I'm going to her. I'm treating her with full dignity. And when Jesus gets on the cross and then, gets up from the grave, it's like, it's on, right? So then you have Matthew 28. Then you have Acts 1. The Spirit is coming and it's going to make you even more powerful. And then we see in Acts 4, we see what the church does. If you want to know what the church is about, go to Acts. See what the church and the first church does in Acts. They don't just go out there and share the 4 laws. No, what they do is they actually get into the temple. Now, this is the funny thing. This blew my mind when I thought about this. The temple at that time, that was the very place where the people ruled who killed Jesus. That was not the place where they just went and they got their worship on Saturday. You know what I mean? It was the place where they felt the least safe. And they went in, and what did they do? They ate together. They sang together. They actually exercised community with their enemies, with the people who were after them at some point, who were going after them. And they also shared all things in common. They broke down the class, the gender, the racial barriers that were between them. And I think that it actually, we see in Paul's Galatians 3:27-29 text, it's where he actually pens what becomes in the early church the baptismal liturgy. He says, in Christ, there is no Jew or Greek. There is no male or female. There is no slave or free. These are all power relationships. And so what is the good news to Paul? Paul's good news is when you are in Christ, when you get baptized, when you are looking around at the world before you get baptized, you see everybody in the way that the world sees them. You see the power divisions. You see male and female. You see slave and free. You see Greek and Jew. And you interact with them according to the way that the world, but when you get baptized, you go under, you get washed of that mess. You come up and you see the image of God in all. You see the capacity of women and men to exercise dominion. You see the capacity of Jews and Greeks to exercise dominion. You see the capacity of people who are enslaved, as much as people who are free, to exercise dominion, because all are made in the image of God.
What are the implications when you get those new eyes?
Well, honestly, the implication is that we should be led to interact differently with ourselves. We should be led to see ourselves as fully human. And I think that means something different for different people, right? So for some, fully human actually means they have full dignity. I don't have to put anything on. I don't have to put on any masks. I can be vulnerable and be okay. I can interact with others and not have to live up to some expectation of what they think I should be. I'm able to just be human. And it's okay and it's good. And actually that creates the conditions where we can then have community.
Okay. So I kind of sent out a little message this morning when I reminded us of this gathering to have you think a bit about dominion, because she throws that word around a lot in this presentation, maybe without necessarily drilling down to how she thinks of that word. So I think we'll start there. What do you think of that word? What's your understanding of what dominion is?
So I guess I would say I mostly have negative associations with the word dominion because it suggests dominance and, ruling over and things like that. But I felt like she was using it with a different meaning that was not necessarily explained. But maybe it was more like having agency in the world and saying that we all have some agency and responsibility. That was my impression.
Yeah, I think my evolving understanding would be responsibility for, dominion meaning responsibility for, but that is certainly not the way I grew up thinking of the definition of that term.
She quite carefully distinguishes between dominion and domination in some of her remarks, leaving us really to deduce that dominion for her is not domination, which is the way we usually read it in those verses from Genesis that Betsy gave us. You know, the verses that Betsy gave us are usually read, or have usually been read, as about control, about mastery, about exploitation. And she seems to be using the word domination for that, and contrasting it quite intentionally with dominion, and without telling us what dominion means.
I think those of you who are NRSV translation users, as the UCC and Union Kong largely is, right in those passages from Genesis, they talk about dominion, and they talk about dominion meaning to rule over the earth, rule over the creatures of the air and the sea. But what it says dominion is not is tyranny, and that there are kind of two kinds of power. That you can have a coercive power if you want to use your dominion in a, as Mike says, a negative way. You can have coercive power, and what she's talking about here is more of a self-giving power. And we've seen that in leaders, right? We know leaders that are dominant and not too nice about it, and then we have other leaders who are more giving. So that's one possible look at dominion.
Yeah, the notion of leadership is an interesting one there. I don't really get the feeling she's talking about leadership a lot. She seems instead to be taking a very sort of early church approach to equality, is what she seems to be talking about. Her focus on the early chapters of Acts, you know, we remember, and they had all things in common. And I find it hard to understand what dominion can mean in that context, which seems to be the context that she's using the word.
Mhm.
How does she fit her notion of dominion with the notion of being created in the image of God?
Yeah, I think we had to read the context. In that passage, you also read that God love, and God's exercises is God's love to people or to the creation. Then he finally said, now we would create a human in our form and likeness. And that is the nature of the same kind of, the dominance is not to control, but to be responsible, to care for this. I think that dominion, if we understand that the term, is we more, I think, a comprehensive understanding is to care, like God cares for us. God has dominion over us. It's a sideline, but you know, one of Peggy's mother's cousin used to live in an island called Isles of Man. It's somewhere in near the England. Mm-hmm. And I look it up and say, what is that? It says that it is a dominion of the British or under England. Dominion is an independent yet Britain seems to have a certain kind of care for that. So those people who live there do not have to pay tax to support the military.
Well, Virginia is the old Dominion.
I was about to say that. That's yeah,
Sorry.
thank you. That's okay. The old Dominion, but we had to pay taxes to
That's
support
what it
them.
means there.
What's Canada's national holiday?
Dominion Day.
Dominion Day.
Dominion Day. Yeah. But other than that holiday, I don't think Canada uses the word Dominion much anymore to describe its territories.
No, I've been trying to think and I can't. There is one song that we used to learn that did have the word Dominion in it, but I can't remember it now. In Days of Yore from Britain's Shore, I think that might have been it, and it did sort of glorify the notion of Dominion. But yeah, I mean, well, we still have the TD Bank. I mean, that's Toronto Dominion, right? I'm sure that's deliberate. That's
I-
not, we'll take
I
good
did
care of
not
your
know
money.
that.
Say that again.
TD, that's what it stands
Thank
for.
you. Ah, okay.
Dominion.
Wait, what does the T stand for?
Toronto.
Oh, interesting. I did not know that.
Never. Yeah.
I didn't know where it came from.
Yeah, TD. They bought up Canada Trust
Hmm.
a few
Okay.
years ago.
I'm so
Look at all
proud.
that we're learning. Yeah, I
What were
don't
you
have
gonna
a
say about
negative.
Yeah.
I don't have a negative context about Dominion. I see it as an old word, and when I think of it, I think of like more positive things, like a care and a responsibility. And if I'm going to think of something mean, I will think more of, power or authoritarian. But if I say Dominion or I hear Dominion, I usually think of it in a good context, a caring context.
Okay.
Our Lord's Prayer, ending with thine is the kingdom of power and glory forever. And the Catholic friends, Lord's Prayer do not include that.
Right.
Yeah, that is, and so sometimes I think about why do the Protestant, use the whole thing, including thine is the kingdom, the power, the glory. And this has something to do with what we think about kingdom or dominion.
Yes. Well, I grew up in a Catholic church, so I always wondered why Protestants added extra words to the Lord's Prayer.
And I did look at some of the translation, different languages, how they express that word. It's an interesting, you could see all kinds of translation. I think it depends very much on the situation and the people, or the background, the people who translate it.
Mhm. And I don't think that the word dominion shows up in the creation story that's found in chapter 2. I'm not 100% sure, but there's a different care level in the second chapter of Genesis. So, well,
Where's the part that, oh, sorry, Betsy. I was going to ask, where's the part that gets translated that you're stewards of the earth? Is that also this Genesis part, or is that a different part?
maybe that's what's in Genesis too, and I should have had that in front of me, but I don't. It is, and steward is definitely a more caring word.
Yeah, definitely.
That's the one I'm more familiar with, and I just don't remember.
Mhm.
I don't remember if it's that passage or somewhere else. But anyway.
Mhm.
some of these big words in the Bible, because I engage in the Bible translation, participated in doing that in different languages before, and these are the hardest word to translate.
Yeah.
The most important biblical concept. It's very hard to put that in another language. It's very uniquely our Christian tradition and Hebraic faith. That there's people of Israel. I have this long tradition of that kind of idea.
So maybe moving on a little bit here, she talks about relationships and things that break down relationships. And are there some specific forces that come to mind that maybe individually break down relationships or systemically break down relationships?
Got quite a long list going from domestic violence to international war.
Yeah.
Seemed to me that she issued an indictment of just about every systemic injustice that we've talked about these past couple of months. Just as a list, very quickly, she did it. That she raised a lot.
I think this has something to do with what the biblical understanding of what sin means. The word sin, S-I-N, is uniquely Christian and uniquely the people of Israel are developed. And when I remember, looking at the history of translation of that word into Chinese and related languages, it's the hardest. Most people think that it's a crime. Of course, sin include crime. That is so hard, and that list. Our speaker listed what's about the concrete expression in our daily life, how the sin manifested in our life.
So what does it mean in your mind, Xingfen, from a Christian perspective? Is it sin is, a broken relationship with God, a failure to observe the great commandment or the commandments? That's really how we are defining sin in the Christian context? Is that what you're understanding?
Yeah, I think relationship is the very basic
Yeah.
of Christian understanding. Our relationship with God, which in Chinese related language translation that include Japanese, Chinese, and Korean, use the word. Usually, sometimes do not include that relationship.
Okay.
And related to that, I thought that Harper was saying that, at least in one part, she was saying that you're asking about specific forces that hinder and break down relationships, and I thought that one of the things she was saying was the failure to recognize other people's dominion in this sort of enlightened sense that we've been using it, to assign dominion to some people but not to all, was one of the forces that breaks down relationships.
Yeah.
I think also, wait, am I muted?
No,
Nope.
we can hear you.
So this is coming at it from left field a bit, but I think maybe the breakdown has to do also with a lack of control of emotion. Like when you see somebody, you judge them, or you categorize them, or you get angry with them, or you want to force them into a different gender identity or whatever. And the reason that I think that is because you're talking about sin. And from what I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chinbang, but the word sin comes up in relation to what Cain does, right? It's the murder of Abel that introduces sin. And that is, I mean, it's a very difficult story, but isn't that at least partly motivated by Cain's jealousy, right? And so it's the breakdown of the relationship between him and God occurs because he can't control, or at least partially because he can't control his emotion, and he loses perspective. And isn't that a little bit what she might be saying too, when you look at people and you can't maintain the relationship because you just project whatever it is on them. Like you don't keep a hold on your emotional response to the person. I don't know. I mean, it may be going too far, but that's what I was thinking.
No, I
I
think
think
the author would not have made it a matter of fratricide had the author of Genesis not meant it to be a story about relationships.
right.
Right.
Cain would have murdered a stranger. So I think you're right on there.
Mhm. And I think that's definitely the disruption of that relationship to God. But is not the whole eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil also a sin? And that's where the relationship between Adam and Eve and God is also broken.
Mm.
But then, I mean, just to be really sort of difficult here, if, I mean, at least going back to Cain and Abel, right? If we agree that the relationship breaks down because of emotion, because of jealousy, and we are made in God's image, at least in 127, we aren't later, but we are in 127. We learn later in the Bible, it's in Exodus, right? When he gives the commandments, he says, I am a jealous God. And so Cain is actually experiencing the emotional effect that God himself admits that he has. And if Cain is made in God's image, then that whole breakdown of a relationship is sort of anticipated in a way, isn't it?
Mm.
I mean, I realize it's kind of getting off track, but
Yeah, but it's interesting.
I really sort of think about Cain and Abel a lot because it's a very problematic story. And if she's talking about dominion and talking about what causes the sort of breakdown with people, I mean, that is, as you already said, right? That is the first major killing in the Bible. And it destroys the relationship. And that is, I mean, I don't know this, but I think in one sense, that's still the worst possible crime, right? Is killing your brother. It's civil war. Like,
And isn't the basis for that jealousy the way that Cain and Abel exercised their dominion in different ways over the earth?
yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Refresh my memory. What do you mean by that, Rick?
Well, Abel brings an offering, Cain brings an offering. One of them is accepted, one of them is rejected. One of them, if I remember right, is an offering of wild caught game animals. And the other one is an offering of domestic crops. Two very different ways to exercise dominion over the earth. And God has just a few lines earlier told us to go out and have dominion over everything. And Cain and Abel both do it. They do it in different ways, and it leads to this complete breakdown in their relationship.
And maybe there's something in that. Maybe they didn't exercise dominion in the way that they were supposed to.
Mhm.
Right.
Although I'm not sure that the Bible tells us how you're supposed to do it, but it certainly indicates that they didn't do it ideally.
Well, if the Cain and Abel story is the sort of negative exemplum of exercising dominion, then isn't the rest of the Bible about restoring relationship? And it seems to me that you've just made dominion the center of the entire Bible, which is a
Yeah.
brilliant stroke, I have to say. Yeah.
Hmm.
So it wasn't just the offerings that they each made, but somehow it was what was in their hearts as they exercised that dominion of killing animals or growing crops. And it was the animal sacrifice that was rejected, right? Cain's
No, that was
No,
accepted.
the animal was accepted.
accepted,
Yeah.
and Cain's was crops.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, I had it backwards. That's how good my Bible knowledge is.
But it's really interesting what you say, because like from what I remember, there is no explicit, clear explanation. Like you're left to kind of figure it out and
Right.
and tease out, which I always think is, I think that's the point of the Bible. It's full of gaps so that you keep going back to it and you keep talking about it and it keeps it alive. And I mean, I always tell my students that, because they get frustrated. They don't understand. They want the answer. And I'm like, there's no answer.
Yeah. And this is why you can keep studying it again and again and again. And it's interesting that the grain offering is what's rejected, because in the chapter 2 of Genesis, that creation story, Adam and Eve are called upon to name all the animals, and then they're also offered anything that grows from the soil as their food. They are not offered the animals as their food in chapter 2.
But so it kind of implies, I guess what I was trying to get at, it implies that it isn't the nature of the offering that is objectionable. It's something about the offerer and maybe where their heart was as they exercised their dominion, rather than what was offered.
Yeah.
At least that's the story. That's my ecological story, and I'm sticking with it.
Okay. We could spend the whole night talking about
Yeah.
Genesis 1 and 2. All right, but I am going to move us along to talk a little bit about, she talks about the disciples coming back and going into the temple where that isn't really their warm and fuzzy place. And I don't know that I've ever really thought about that before, that they're in there with all their enemies who are the ones that crucified Jesus, and they go in there and break bread with them and worship with them. How do you feel about that? Has there ever been a situation or a place, or, how do we find those safe places to do that?
Really urging us to look for the unsafe places.
Safe, yeah, that's
Yeah. You get the impression from her that if you feel safe, you're not really doing your job.
Yeah. How do you
Yeah,
feel
I think
about that?
Not real happy.
Feel unsafe.
I think in a place where you feel like you are vulnerable and you still wanted to have that relationship, I think that's it. So may I inject and say that after all this discussion, we look at the issue from the ruling part or the ruler's part. we never, I wouldn't say never, but we hardly think about those who are ruled or subdued or dominated. What do they feel? You know, during the Japanese rule of Taiwan, many of the famous Christian, visit Taiwan to talk with the people in Taiwan. And when they went back to Japan, they have totally different idea about how to be a good colonizer, you know, right kind of dominant people. One of the most famous person will be Kagawa. I think we all heard about him. And the other one was later on became the president or chancellor of Tokyo University, Yanaibara. Both of them became pacifist. And Yanaibara was economic, agricultural economist. He visited Taiwan. He went back to Japan and told the Japanese government, our policy to Taiwan is wrong. We make them like our servant to grow food for us. And something, we have to change that attitude. Mm. And both of them become real pacifists.
And when was this, Xingfen? Was this before the war?
Or during the war?
It was during the war. Okay.
Yeah, and some of them were just before. I think I would say that before the Pacific War, before 1941. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think they are in 1930s. Mm.
Well, I think you already said this, Rick, in some ways, but I think the charge here is to have the courage to go where we're not comfortable, but then the wisdom, then to think about how to transform it, right? How to de-escalate, so to speak, as seemingly the early Christians did in Acts by sitting down and having a meal or whatever. But, it was it was an act of resistance in its own way, or at least courage. It was not it didn't sound like, it started out as a kumbaya moment, right? Let's break bread together and that. So the challenge is learning how to transform those places. Mm-hmm.
But I always think, I guess when I was just out of college, I had a friend who was Catholic, and I grew up Lutheran, and she invited me to her retreat. I had a great time, but then when it came to communion, I wasn't allowed. So that always bothers me. Or, I had a good friend whose father passed away and had the service. And again, I, being, not being Catholic, is lightning going to strike me if I go up there? But they can come to our church, and have communion, but, we go to the Catholic church and we can't. So that always kind of bothered me. Mm-hmm. Michael's grimming there. I mean, Michael, did you grow up Catholic?
Did. Yes, I did. And I remember that rule. We really thought, well, wow, you can't take communion, and I don't know what that's about. It seems like, to me, it seems like somebody thought about it as a member benefit. And it's like, well, if we give away the communion, then, they don't have to be Catholic. They can just come and get
secret communion. Password.
Yes. So I think it was, I don't know. I've never quite understood it. I think there is a deeper theological explanation, which I will not attempt to replicate. But I think there is a rationale for it, having to do with being consecrated or something to the body of Christ. But I agree with you, Joy. It just strikes me as, exclusive clubbiness, and I'm not sure that most Catholics are even very dedicated to that rule. They don't much believe it, from what I can tell, anymore. But
Yes, I have to admit that several years ago, 5, 6, 7 years ago, a very, very dear friend of mine passed away. He was 53 years old. And I went to his funeral, which was a Catholic mass. And when the priest said that, I was sitting next to a complete stranger. I already knew the rules, but when the priest said that, we looked at each other and said, "What would Pete want?" And we went up. Because we figured that priest didn't know us. How would he know if we were Catholic or not?
Yeah.
And in my tradition, it's not about him.
Yeah. Fair enough.
I think
That was my radical.
Yeah, they do have some way to break that. I remember, you know, uh, they will get, some of these priests will get a special dispensation that, for instance, they could give communion to me, and they knew that I was a Protestant minister. Yet they give a special dispensation because I and this Catholic priest have been working together for so many things, ministry together, particularly to migrant workers from Philippines. They are mostly Catholic.
Mhm.
There are a few Protestant, so we have to have a special service during the Easter, Christmas, and we have communion. And so I was given the permission that my for the doing the service is just as valid as a Catholic priest. Two of us will do. I'll do the bread, and he'll do the wine, and that's it. And all the people knew that there's one minister and one priest, but they all came to participate in that.
Yes, and I think that's a perfect example of when church can create community, knowing what other people's traditions are so that you can open up from your hard and fast rules to encompass more people.
Well, even I'm the chair for the women's retreat, and we're thinking of we're having a meeting Thursday, and we're really thinking about having a rabbi lead our retreat. Just something, someone in the community. Even last week, I think a few of you guys were on that interfaith Zoom meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just so nice to hear different perspectives from different spiritual leaders in the community and how they're dealing with the pandemic and so forth. And we're all human, right? But I think it would be exciting to have a different leader that's not in, a UCC, to kind of get a totally different perspective. And I think, talking to Dave, I said, do you think this will, work? He's like, sure, yeah, let's do this, So I think it's exciting to get other different perspectives on things. We'll see if people show up on the lawn at the end of April or not.
I find that
but
the
I think it's a
Union
good
Con
thing.
community is very open to pretty much anything you can throw at them. I think it's cool.
Cool. Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. We are at 7:48 already. Rick, do you want to pull up some of those questions that might sort of close out our entire time together?
Yes, I think that I need to paste them again and hit
Thank you,
return.
Catherine, for joining us all these so many times.
I don't want to disrupt, but thank you all so much.
Well, I am remembering to record this one, so if you want to catch the end, it'll be there.
Okay, so Betsy, I've pasted those questions.
Yeah, so kind of keeping everything in mind, and I don't know if you remember all the sessions, all the different Citizenship says resistance and hospitality, love for the land, as justice work, cruciformity, I'm still bending my head around that one. Relating to others, and this one, relationship as the image of God. And so what all of these theologians have really been telling us is that we need to get out there and do something. We need to be the disruptors of systemic situations that are not putting all people in that same place of equal dominion. So these questions here, I think, are a way to look at our church community, Union Kong, and what does that look like? How are we doing in terms of, breaking down some of these systemic situations? Or what does I think starting with this first question, it's more about what does our community, our church community look like? Let's take that kind of on the very physical. What do we look like?
We look a lot like what I see on the Zoom screen ahead of me. We really do.
Except for this corner up here where Ching Fen is. He's a special person.
Very happy for that too. Yeah. But
In fact,
we are.
I became like, to make, the church real, more real. I always, I was new in, I broke so many glasses, on top. I was the first non-white to serve one board of directors or board trustees that has been there for 150 some years before I came in. And all white. And at first they look at me and in different eyes. Then later on, they feel like I was really one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have same purpose to fulfill.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's important. And who is our God? Who is our Lord? Who has dominion over us? I think that is, to me, is far more important. So now I'm less conscious of my race in the church. I think I said it one time when I was a seminary student at Princeton. I wanted to be a candidate. They told me that there was no church that I could serve, no point to be a candidate.
Mm-hmm.
That situation, and now as compared with what we are today, in our Union Kong, this is totally different.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really encouraging to hear, and I really appreciate you saying that, Ching Fen. Rick, I hear what you're saying, and it's impossible to disagree. I think it is, it's mostly white, and there are many ways in which we do not reflect America or even our local community. And I do recognize that, but I still feel that there are elements of true diversity within our community, and it's an ongoing process. It's not a thing that gets fixed, all at once. And maybe it never gets fixed. Maybe when you think you've got representation in one area, you find that, oh, well, maybe we aren't as well represented over here as we should be, or thought we ought to be. And so I always find that a tiny bit frustrating, because I kind of feel like, I don't want to nail the church, our church, or any other institution over. I'll use a loaded word, but I don't mean it in a bad way. But I don't want it to become a quota-driven kind of approach. But I do want us to keep in mind, for me anyway, it's important for us to keep in mind that sort of ever receding goal of representation, inclusion, community. And and it's fair to say that we maybe never reach that goal exactly, but I do think our church has a lot of representation of groups that aren't always accepted well in churches.
No, I think you're quite right there. We also, though, I think we've probably learned that we have to ask ourselves, is the overall complexion of our congregation, is it affected by the systemic injustices that we've been talking about? We can talk about it geographically, of course. It's simply the fact that Union Congregational draws people from the northern parts of Montclair and the northern parts of Bloomfield, while the southern parts of both our towns are ethnically and racially quite different. And that, of course, comes back to the fact that there is a systemic problem that results in that de facto segregation of the two towns. Does Union have a sort of counterpart congregation in the southern parts of Bloomfield and Montclair?
First Con.
What do you mean by
First
account?
Con.
I mean, is there a UCC congregation in the Black and Hispanic neighborhoods in Montclair and Bloomfield?
There's a UCC church. Well, First Congregational is a UCC church, and they're very diverse in color and also in the LGBT community. So yeah, they are definitely more diverse than Union Cong is.
And is that simply a matter of geographic location?
Well, I think that, as you pointed out, our location, we have to also think about our history. Union Cong has always had a reputation for being a rich church. And if that makes you feel unwelcome because your finances are not aligned to the people that you see when you walk in the door, that's a stumbling block that I think First Cong does not have.
Interesting.
But Betsy, wasn't it a few years ago that First Con, like I was out in California, but like in 2010, wasn't it about to shut down at one point?
Oh yeah.
They just didn't have.
They were really close to the
neighborhood.
edge.
Yeah. I mean, Union, we're very, very fortunate to have the endowment that we have that will keep us afloat probably for some time to come. And we, of course, we have fabulous congregants. You guys are just 7 of them. But, this question here about what does our community look like and what should it look like? How do you get there? And this next question about what are some of the concerns in your local community? If you think about where our local community being Upper Montclair, what are the concerns of that local community?
I'm not in Montclair, so I'm not going to answer this one.
Well, I can tell you that one of the concerns many years ago that Union Cong addressed was middle schoolers hanging out in the street on a Friday afternoon after school lets out. And so
True.
they opened the side door.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
But are there other concerns that maybe you are aware of that I'm not.
Seems to me that often when we talk about concerns, we actually look just outside our community. When we think about concerns, I'm saying we, and I should say I. When I think about concerns, I think immediately Newark, Patterson, Passaic. I don't really think of Bloomfield and Montclair.
Mhm.
And that may be because there is this veneer of relative wealth and relative stability that covers over things that I'm just not aware of. I like to think of myself as reasonably well informed about my town, but I'm beginning to think maybe I'm not.
For about 10 years, I was part of this congregation. They're scattered around, not only in Montclair. Actually, there's no other people from Montclair who was in that congregation. All the Taiwanese scattered in different places. It was quite an experience for me, and we participate in the what they call a soup kitchen in Newark.
Mhm.
And sometimes it was very hard for me to persuade other people from the congregation to go with me. There are some who did go with me faithfully to do the same, to do that thing every once. Then I think there's, I think all the races a certain kind of bias or kind of feel they just do not know how to speak to a different race, particularly darker skin
Mm.
people. And those who come to the soup kitchen are mostly dark skin
Mhm.
people in Newark.
Mhm.
It was very good experience for me. While other people are busy in serving the food, I always sit down to talk with the people who came. And now I found that it is more important to me than serve the food. I think there are enough people who is willing to do the service.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it was interesting to find out one young man told me that he was the first time, it was the first time that he was talking to an Asian and a minister who sit down to talk to him.
Wow.
You know, he introduced himself about what he did and how he lost his job.
Yeah, that's one thing that I think has always been positive in some of the youth mission trips where the kids would go into the city or they would go into Newark or wherever it was that they would go and participate in Soup Kitchen or various other ministries, as they encourage them to sit down and talk to the guests, not just stand behind the food line. Because that's where you get the story, and that's where you form the relationship and get that comfort level of speaking with the other.
Yeah. Yeah, in a way, it's putting yourself in a place that doesn't feel like a safe place.
Mhm.
I think it was an important thing. And there was a medical doctor whom because one half of the congregation, they are medical doctors, I tell you, that service. And I took one of them with me to the soup kitchen. After that, he wrote an article in of course in Chinese script, and say he should have, joined this much earlier. What kind of you know feeling he has, with this kind of service.
Mhm.
And he sees so many people who are patients. I mean, he picks up people's physical things, but he never had a chance really to serve someone.
Mm, mm.
I just wanted to add that I think that as a congregation, I think um, we do have a perspective beyond the walls of our church, I think, about community needs. I don't know that I would describe them as Upper Montclair concerns, but we participate in a food kitchen as a congregation. Sometimes um, we have the SMART program. We have I think there are concerns about Black Lives Matter kinds of issues, and I think those are deeply important in our general area. They are concerns of our community, our local community, just not as local as Upper Montclair.
Mm.
And in many ways, I think they're probably the more important things for us to be involved in than what somebody in Upper Montclair is worried about, to be honest. But
Well, look at this, the things we're supporting in the alternative, Christmas fair.
yeah, yeah,
We have a number of really just important things.
absolutely.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because that really does cover a lot of these justice issues.
It does.
And, and also speaking to what Mike just said, I think about liberation in our community, and Union Kong does a lot of work and runs a lot of programs for us, within the community. We're doing America to Me, and we have conversations on white privilege, and we have this where we can really look about different injustices, and uh, even the interfaith thing that we did with sorry, I'm struggling with my words so much, with Union Baptist. There have been like a lot of really good opportunities for our community, and the interfaith thing that they had on Zoom the other night,
Yeah.
for us to broaden our horizons. And this is all really, really good stuff. And this is all stuff that has brought the Leadership Council to a place where they recognize that if we're going to try to move the congregation to a place where we are more inclusive, because people aren't going to run in our doors just because we've done all this work within our church community. So they're actually putting together a task force of people to try to figure out how do we get ourselves ready for the community that we want to be. We can't just say, we're open for all people. How do we get the LGBT community to see that we are open, and what's going on in our building or outside our building that really will make them feel welcome? And then there are other groups of people, whether it's African Americans or Hispanics, they're not just going to come running into the building because maybe we as individuals are ready to welcome them, or we think we're ready to welcome them. But what is our building saying? What is our atmosphere saying? And I think it's pretty exciting that they've put together a whole task force of people that are really going to look at that.
Yeah, so moving in a way from being welcoming to being inviting.
Yeah. You can't sit there and worship as kind of stiff white people that listen to, the old Wesley tunes and Bach if you are hoping that you're going to have a more mixed environment of worshipers. You have to be ready to receive them on a level that makes them feel welcome and comfortable.
Mhm.
And they might want to move around a little bit more. They might want to sing something with a little pep and maybe clap their hands. So I think it's all exciting. I think it could be a good way. And when I think about this, we use the word liberation in here too. I'm not always sure that the residents around Upper Montclair are ready to be liberated. I sometimes think they like who they are, kind of rich and white and suburban-ish. So maybe having a church amongst them that's mixing it up a little bit. They are not happy with the side door program, a lot of them.
Oh, really? The neighbors?
Yeah,
I did not know that.
yeah.
They're too noisy.
Having all those loud screaming middle schoolers
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
dark complexion and they're not always down with that.
Yeah.
It's one day a week.
Yeah.
That's
One
one
day.
day.
Yeah. I did volunteer for us, a few times. And
Yes, I know.
I really enjoy it. The kids were curious about me as well, because I'm different from others. And so I took the advantage of that to teach them something. I I calligraphy, how to write, some Chinese character and so on. And, and I told them, it came out from the image of what that is, and then how, the sun came into being, how to write. And I think the kids enjoyed, those who came.
Yeah, they loved it. I remember that. Mm-hmm.
I came to join a union because, I knew some of the friends, like the Baileys, I knew him before I moved to the United States. And so he was here, and so I came, and I found myself to fit in quite well, and so continue.
Good. We're glad you did.
Mhm.
Well,
So I'm going to just throw out something, not to start a new topic, but this question that you have, number 6, how can the church create conditions where we can have community? For me personally, don't want to get too hung up on the idea that the community is in the church building, and that the only way that we are sort of changing our community or making it more welcoming is if we're getting people to come to worship on a Sunday. And then we can see, aha, there's somebody. Like, to me, that's a little bit, for me, the community doesn't have to be in the church on a Sunday. I think
that's a
that
great
one can
point.
actually
Yep,
increase
is.
the community beyond, and maybe on a personal level, and maybe not even sort of saying directly, oh, I'm a member of Union Kong, like in Upper Montclair, like come on a Sunday. Like, I think sometimes maybe just doing the things that we think will help and will make ourselves less racist rather than sort of trying to make the community at church like reflect that. I don't know if that's making any sense.
It does make complete
Oh, that's
sense.
interesting, yeah.
Definitely. I think that's a really good point. And I think the idea, if we could be a known and welcome presence in the community, I mean, that's as good as maybe even better than just getting people in the door. I think that's a really good point. Not that it's a small thing to get people in the door, but
No.
I think you're right. It's not the only sign of success. At least I would say that. Yeah.
Any other real wrap-up inspirational remarks? Or not so inspirational?
I think that was the one. Well done, Allison.
Thank you.
It has been really wonderful to have all of you here and to have some of these conversations that we've had. I think there are some that will stick with me, some that I still am, squinting a little bit about, but it's been good to have the discussion. And I really appreciate Rick saying yes when I said, would you join me in this? Because 7 weeks is a big ask.
Thanks, Rick.
Well, thank you guys. Yeah. Rick.
So,
Yeah. Thanks to Rick and Betsy, but to everyone really. It's good conversations and good topics. I really enjoyed the video lead-ins.
yeah.
Very helpful.
So thank you. And if you ever want to revisit any of this, check out the YouTube channel. They're all there.
Great.
Okay. All right.
Wonderful.
Right.
Yeah, great.
I'm going to miss you all now.
Yeah, we'll miss you all, and I hope everyone has a happy Christmas.
Yep. We'll see you
I
at
hope
church.
someone will organize another one.
Oh, yeah. We're
I
going to take a break,
similarly.
maybe in the new year.
Yeah, in the new year. Sounds
Next
good.
year.
All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right.
Thank you.